Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 15th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Its title being The Moral Quantities Must Not Be Excluded in War. The text follows. But now the activity in war is never directed solely against matter. It is always at the same time directed against the intelligent force which gives life to this matter, and to separate the two from each other is impossible. But the intelligent forces are only visible to the inner eye, and this is different in each person, and often different in the same person at different times. As danger is the general element in which everything moves in war, it is also chiefly by courage, the feeling of one's own power, that the judgment is differently influenced. It is to a certain extent the crystalline lens through which all appearances pass before reaching the understanding. And yet we cannot doubt that these things acquire certain objective value simply through experience. Everyone knows the moral effect of a surprise, of an attack in flank or rear. Everyone thinks less of the enemy's courage as soon as he turns his back, and ventures more in a pursuit than when pursued. Everyone judges of the enemy's general by his reputed talents, by his age and experience, and shapes his course accordingly. Everyone casts a scrutinizing glance at the spirit and feeling of his own and the enemy's troops. All these and similar effects in the province of the moral nature of man have established themselves by experience, are perpetually recurring, and therefore warrant our reckoning them as real quantities of their kind. What could we do with any theory which should leave them out of consideration? Certainly experience is an indispensable title for these truths. With psychological and philosophical sophistries no theory, no general should meddle. So in this paragraph, von Clausewitz is assessing what these moral forces, moral quantities, how it's translated in here, really are, right? And this is very important because we have seen how von Clausewitz defines war fundamentally a clash between moral forces. And that's the single most important thing. And here he explains us why, because he says, now the activity in war is never directed solely against matter. So here you can hear, first of all, the criticism towards those positive theories of the art of war that tend to stop just to matter as such, by taking out every moral factor and simply saying, if I deploy in that way, if I use that weapon, if I occupy that ground, I'm gonna win, right? Without considering what the will, the strengths, the moral resources involved are that make the largest amount of difference in real war, right? So von Clausewitz goes on and says, it is always at the same time directed against the intelligent force which gives life to this matter. So the activity in war, in other words, is directed it is always directed at the same time against the intelligent force which gives life to this matter, right? So there is never a moment in which the moral clash stops, right? You can't stop shooting at someone. You can run out of ammo. You can't stop firing because you think it's not going to make an effect. You simply can't suspend the military action at one point because you're tired. You have to reorganize your troops and whatever. But moral forces are always there. What pushes this matter to work, right? It's always under your control, and it always stays there, so that you can have all the richest arsenals in the world. But if you have no moral resources, they're completely useless. You can't do anything with a rifle if you don't have a reason to use it, right? This is the point. And that's little, corollary to this. It's obviously why war is definitely the continuation of politics by other means, right? Because it's a mere instrument. It's a political act and an act of violence compelled that compels the enemy to fulfill our will, and that's it. You don't do anything with war, with violence, with weapons, if you don't have a motive to use them. That's the point. That's why people are obsessed by war as a kind of a, swallowing monster by itself, right? That has somehow its own, its own freedom. Never. It's always politics that at all times directs war, and there's no way out of that. Never. So you can't blame war. You have to blame politics and its ethics, its responsibilities. If you have to blame it, sometimes war is necessary. Like if you have to fight against a dictatorship, come and tell me that that's not that's a negative thing. That's a negative form of violence. We should respect violence in this sense, because otherwise we couldn't conceive in resistance to, National Socialism or to communism as a righteous action, which it is for our culture, at least our moral standards. So aside from that, I stress this because it's partly like it sounds like it's on a different level, but it's exactly the same thing. If you consider only matter, you consider a completely abstracted situation that has nothing to do with reality in war. Hence, that positivistic approach that is concentrated just on material or kind of physical factors is nothing. It's like having a puppet and not knowing how to maneuver to make it move, right? With your own attention. Like it doesn't it remains there. It's empty. It doesn't do anything by itself. The same is war with politics, right? And that's where the moral forces come into play, because it's exactly the political mover that represent that moral force. Like the moral force obviously is influenced by matter. You can't say, and in fact now we will be reading what Von Clausewitz says about that. You can't say that the material dimension doesn't have importance, but it has importance as long as there is a moral dimension attached to it, or a spiritual dimension, whatever we want to call it here. That's the point. And this one is nothing but the reason why you are there in order to fight, right? Which is a pretty important reason, because you're there to kill and to get killed. So it's basically the single most dangerous and morally demanding action that you can think, humanly speaking, on average, like for given the pressure that war presents you with. And von Clausewitz concludes the phrase by saying, and to separate the two, that is basically matter and spirit from each other, is impossible. I want to stress this impossibility. Because here, von Clausewitz is referring to this separation that a positive approach to the theory of the art of war would entail. That is saying, let's leave aside what we can't quantify, what is subjective, right? And pretending that it's how war can work. Absolutely false, because in this sense, subjectivity is fundamental to whatever is going on at that point. Because without that subjectivity, you wouldn't know what to do with your material means, right? And to separate them for the sake of lack of method of approach to this theory is not like well, maybe. No, it's utterly impossible. It's completely impossible. It doesn't make sense to reason that in that way. It's as if you had to tell, I don't know, how a car drives without any agent actually driving it. Here it doesn't matter whether it's a robot or a human being. The point is that there has to be an intention there that goes beyond the same war, meaning it goes beyond the same car and how it drives. It goes It's about fundamentally what do you do that for in the first place? That is, in this case, what do you fight for? Why is that you're like doing this terrible thing? You know, what are the reasons, the factors that brought you to decide to solve this situation using violence, taking away life from someone, and even risking your own? Like that's a big problem in itself, and it needs a further understanding, in fact, of politics and of society, without which war does not exist. Because what is war at the end of the day? Is an action, right? And there is no action without intention, without, like, say, without some motive for it, right? So war is intangible in this sense. It's what you do. It's an approximation, if you want. It's what you do in this context that is dictated by politics and society. So it's never the other way around. Like war, maybe this is important to say, war can backfire. We have seen in the previous lectures how easily war can go straight from what we have planned. Basically, it does all the time, because it's the single human, the human activity into which things go in the most different way from what foreseen. This is something that was unknown since ancient times, in maxims and quotes, etc. And it is true. But that can happen. Why? Because you're fighting against someone. So it's not war that by itself takes over, right? In this kind of apocalyptic picture in which war becomes the enemy in itself. You can hear that this worst garbage that makes you understand that those people have never even read anything about von Clausewitz. You're fighting against someone. So, like it was understood already, like if you read Machiavelli, you can't start war when you want, but you can't end it when you want, because things can go seriously wrong because you're fighting against someone else, and therefore you're fighting not against war, not against something that goes out of hand, goes on its own way, because war in itself has no intelligence, no autonomy in this sense. It's not independent. It depends on a political will. Then in that case, that in every case, it's your own and the one of your enemy. And that's what war is. It's you two fighting, right? And the way, and I'm stressing this aspect because it's, embarrassing, because I can't find any other adjective. About how, especially in our Western world, not that the rest is better on this ground, but how incredibly, like, we have embraced this emotionalistic, like, approach to war, for which, and let's say moralistic approach to war, has nothing to do with the spiritual dimension here. It has to do with of the forces of war. It has to, the moralistic attitude, the kind of preachy behavior towards war, thinking that war it's wrong in itself. Like, it's not wrong because it's not the actions of people who do certain things that are wrong. It's this abstract thing that basically doesn't even exist, because it's literally people fighting against each other with their choices, with their political responsibilities, with their civic duties. And I don't know why we have done this. Like, it's an enormous form of hypocrisy, of ignorance, of deep misunderstanding. It stemmed from some movements that, in spite of their attitudes, have actually extremely and radically violent ideologies. Like, if you take pacifism, for example, by itself, it's not less violent than militarism, frankly. Like, it has the same degree of radical ferocity in itself. And actually, pacifism in itself increases violence in an incredible fashion, right? It's extremely dangerous. And you can't see that in the simplification of the mindset here. Like here we have a 19th century thinker that has literally taught us what war is, so that we can be warned about what it is, and in order to make the best choice whether whether we find in this situation or we need to record to that in some way, that we can, so that we can be aware about the intrinsic risks. But on the other side, you have ideologies such as pacifism or culturalism that pretend that this is not true by definition, and whoever stands against this obviously has to be wiped out, which is basically violence all the way, right? Von Clausewitz theory is most highly ethical because it shows you every single time that you don't have to trust any dogmatic attitude. You have to stay open to every situation and determine what is going on, and understanding who is doing what and why, which is extremely complicated. Instead, these simplistic dichotomies have polluted our world in an incredible fashion. We have dumbed down, it's kind of almost of a childish behavior approach to reality, and in fact got back to tribalism, to emotionalism, to the deep intrinsic refuse of knowledge, of intelligence, of rationality, right, which these thinkers instead were mastering in here. And that's where you will be told, oh well, von Clausewitz inspired, I don't know, war, Prussian militarism, stuff like that. No, those were best misunderstandings of von Clausewitz when they took this extremistic, I don't know how to say it in English, but the drift, deviation, this is the term, that in fact backfired. Because look at World War I. Look at what the optimism of what positivism had brought onto the table before the First World War, right? And that was a deep misunderstanding of Clausewitz in theory, right? It was this over-reliance. It's like from evolution, right? Evolution is neutral, is beautiful, it's a scientific theory. And what happened, it was immediately stolen by extremist racist or proto-racist thinkers, such as Spencer, etc., and produced what? Scientific racism, proto-scientific racism. Of course, they didn't know that at the time that it is. So it's extremely easy to misunderstand every single message, which is the theory that has not been taken and raped and taken completely out of context, right? In every situation, who has ever, I don't know, interpreted the Bible in an identical fashion? Nobody does, right? But the Vom Kriege is extremely clear, has an extremely truly scientific approach to the matter, like it's methodologically speaking, let's say. It's a refusal of positivism, but also found in that, not like throwing out there maxims, feelings, and pretending they're true, right? And what is happening today seems to be extremely dangerous, because that's exactly when disasters, where violence, where extremism rises, and people get killed for no reason, for no valid reason, right? So we have to be sharp, and that's why this book should be taught, like even in schools, frankly, because it's a very difficult book altogether. Like, you should study it properly, not reading it. You forget to read the Vom Kriege and pretending to understand it, because you can't. This is not a book to be read. This is a book to be studied, which is a wholly different story. In here, I'm trying to do my best, but I'm not an expert myself. But I'm at least spending a lot of time explaining every single paragraph, even because to say, at least to highlight what I think is the right track in here. So here, every attempt of separating sharply the moral dimension of war from the physical one is a disaster, right? You can't do it. It's the complete misunderstanding of what the whole Clausewitzian doctrine is about, and that's why I so bitterly criticize things like war gamistic approaches to reality, or this over reliance on thinking about weapons, about technology, because this is exactly going towards that mistake. There is an astonishing amount of people today that believes fundamentally that war is about technology, that war is about what kind of weapon you use, and what its performance is, and not knowing anything, for example, about doctrine of employment, or not even posing themselves that question, or thinking that an army wins wars because it has one weapon. Right, there are people who generally believe such things, and you start understanding at this point that our world is completely unaware, completely illiterate in terms of strategic culture in general. And this is a great problem. Another great problem, because even people who study military history at large seems to have great problems, to struggle a lot to understand this essential. This is literally the ABC of war. I mean, if you don't get that, do another job, because that's not for you. And this is embarrassing, in fact, of how many times and how many bankrupt, I don't know, I don't even know how to define them, writers, people who want to sell stuff, books, they always have to, I don't know, to rewrite film. It's like those people who will tell you, in 2019, today we will tell you what was the real story of the Battle of Waterloo, as if we didn't know that from 200 years, as if nobody ever studied that, as if everybody was an idiot. So here we also have to re-understand from Clausewitz, because this deep truths and complex thinking, that it's different. I come here to tell you how it really is. Von Clausewitz tells you how it really is, you piece of trash. Just study him and try to understand. When you read that stuff, you realize that von Clausewitz misunderstood immediately, right? Or at least banalized or instrumentalized to nothing. As I was saying before, this book is difficult, but at the same time, its message, its essentials are fairly simple in themselves. I mean, it's not such a I mean, contorted, twisted thinking. It's really linear. It's really simple. It's meant to be like that because it's what intelligent people write or explain things like. Unlike me, even I take hours for explaining a few paragraphs, but at least you have this anchor represented by von Clausewitz's text. And so if you're really, really interested, I make these videos just to make people aware that this thing exists in the first place, and why it is important, and why it's not just like all the other stuff, meaning that objectively there is nothing like this. Nobody has ever written anything like this. Do not trust any military thinker aside from von Clausewitz. Never think to put anybody who talks about war before von Clausewitz, because that means and it's not that I'm paid by I don't know, von Clausewitz hairs, which he didn't have, to tell the truth, but it's really that this is it. At this point, I've been spending how many videos I made on this, more than 60 videos about von Clausewitz. At this point, you can't go check them, but this is where I insist the most. Never think that you are more intelligent than this man. Never think that you have something more to add to this. Never think that you get it all and you can afford to criticize it as if you were better, because you are not, whoever you are, right? Nobody is. So study it and don't go straight. Be objective. Try to be objective, because that's where it starts from. Mostly, it's really about honesty, which seems to be a pretty rare commodity nowadays, especially from an intellectual point of view. So, going on, von Clausewitz writes, but the intelligent forces, so those who animate matter, as we've seen, are only visible to the inner eye. And this is different in each person, and often different in the same person at different times. Now, this is very important, of course, because while matter can be kind of physically calculated, right, and that's what sparked initially the first interest towards this element in the construction of a theory of the art of war, is that intelligent forces, moral forces, are not visible, right? You can't measure them. Von Clausewitz uses the inner eye, right? This is a form of an understanding of intelligence, the coup d'oeil, that he also has mentioned in previous occasions. So this is an ability that can't be assessed scientifically, but hence this is where it becomes an art. And this is different in each person, and often different in the same person at different times, for Clausewitz writes. Right, so this is not just a problem saying, I have different opinions from someone else. This is sometimes that, like, all the time, at least where I'm concerned, I have conflicting opinions all the time, right? The whole deal of, I think of an aware, responsible person is realizing that there is no opinion that you can keep there in the closet, thinking that, you have thought about it and you can put it away. Like, von Clausewitz pushes you to be constantly challenged, because the moment in which you stop that, literally the enemy takes over. Because can't exploit that simple-minded attitude of presuming to have understood everything, while it's already probably the hardest enterprise to understand ourselves in the first place. So these moral forces are the ones that really complicate, as we've seen also in the previous paragraph, the whole picture when you're trying to understand how to theorize war, right? To make a system out of it that you can positivistically applicate and scope and to use practically. So and always there is a fascinating aspect of the story here that you would probably say, well, but this is a mess then. Well, yes, it is. We have already ascertained that since the beginning of the book. But there is still an important part of the story that von Clausewitz also stresses a lot, is that what is your own responsibility, right? If you think there is a preset, pre-packed, preconfectioned way to applicate to solve a problem, basically you have nothing to do with that. You grow lazy, you grow even irresponsible because you presume that someone else was thinking about that. Well, in this case, it's very different, because this is something that depends entirely on you, right? It depends solely on you, de facto, right? Obviously, yeah, we can study military history, we can study these theories, we can study, we can command an army, theoretically, probably not many of us will ever do, but we have surely people who study these things, who know better, who have a better understanding. But at the same time, what it says is that when you're out there, and this is not just valid for war, this is really valid for everything in life, you are on your own. You are responsible. You choose. You can make mistakes. You will do a lot of mistakes, very likely, because we all do all the time. But at least we will learn from them, and at least we will develop this ability that is in fact more of an art than it doesn't derive from a scientific approach. It derives from like coping with the unexpected at every single moment and kind of growing able or experienced and kind of aware and functional for that, but not always having the solution for the story, because the situation changes constantly, all of the time. So you are entitled of this responsibility. We all are, right? And this is beautiful, because it's probably really better to make a mistake on your own than doing something right, simply because someone else told you to do it, right? And you really having nothing to do with the moral decision into that. Because in the first case, you will learn something, and chances are that failure will spark some wisdom, at least, or some intelligence, or both, which are, however, two very different things. That however often in part go together, let's say. That can be of use, of practical use, right? So that next time maybe you will do better, or maybe you will take it to the next step, because that failure already gave you the experience necessary to cope with that level and already getting at the further point. And this is empowering. Von Clausewitz is not for people who pretend to depend on others. We leave those to I don't know, even nowhere. Like, Von Clausewitz talks to responsible people, to mature people that know what they have to do, right? That know what their responsibilities are, at least they know how to take them, right? The rest are doomed to failure. Like, people who cannot take their own responsibility are doomed to failure. Fortunately, history showed this pretty well. So there is some justice, after all, in history. And it's not that simple, but that's really the point. It is not even when you know what your responsibility is, and that's what makes you responsible, because you know what's going to happen. And okay, well, let's go on. And von Clausewitz writes, as danger is the general element in which everything moves in war, it is also chiefly by courage, the feeling of one's own power, that the judgment is differently influenced. So that this is incidentally what we were just saying, right? War is a freaking dangerous place, right? So it's this understanding, this judgment that you have on what is going on is principally courage. So this feeling of your own force that influences on your judgment, and that forms, so to say, the lens that the impressions get through in order to reach understanding. This is very important because it's a concept. The one with courage, and more specifically with determination, is a constant dialectic that you're presented with constantly, but especially in war more than anything else, because you're under an extreme pressure, and if you do not have you don't have the certainty. It's like a gamble, right? You never know whether your next move is going to be right. There's nothing like that. This is why this is an art, not a science. But it involves all the times risk. So if you don't grow some courage within your responsibility, you can't take action properly. In fact, von Clausewitz has identified more specifically this determination as the particular form of courage that basically makes action following to intention. That is, you can be an extremely intelligent person, but if you don't have courage, you can't do what's right, even if you know what it is, right? So this is not really a moralistic teaching. This is simply because von Clausewitz says, you could be determined, courageous, intelligent. You might have understood, but sorted everything out correctly by a certain standard. If you're this is very unlikely, right? But still, you can't fail, because probably you're really not. You really haven't accomplished that, at least in a satisfactory fashion. So the certainty of victory in war is basically non-existent. Like, that's not even the point. It's more about why you're there. Like, what are you doing? What is that you want to achieve? Not really whether you will win or not. Because most of the times, most of the problems that are created, that we pose ourselves, derive from the fact that we actually don't know whether we will make it at one point, nor how things will actually go. Like, we even know how theoretically how to behave, but we're not sure that things will go well. And guess why? Because most of the times there is something in between that can't be framed into, in fact, a scientific approach, and we don't know how that can go. And definitely moral forces are between these. How many times we're actually dependent on someone, certain things to go well. Like, think about bureaucracy. We'll probably have to deal with that at one point, unfortunately. Sometimes we depend on a completely external person, and it's not that we can't do much about that. In that sense, it's not really more a problem of responsibility. It's a problem of, maybe that person's responsibility, but not our own. But also, we don't know how people will react. We don't know how, our relations will go, because we don't know essentially what's in other people's mind, how that works, but especially we don't even know how it would work on ourselves. So courage, this is what von Clausewitz is saying here, is your own reliance on yourself, right? This feeling of your own power that helps you to judge what can be done or not, right? That is essentially telling you whether you can gamble or not, because that is already expecting what may happen can go wrong, and you have to put into account how much you're willing to lose, right, at that point. So it's very important to understand this also, maybe in these terms, is that your courage is your moral force, right? So if war is a clash between two moral forces that are in turn much more complex within themselves and ever changing, objectively what you feel and what you choose to do is more important than how material things will go at the end of the day. Sometimes we're extremely surprised by the effort that we can make in order to achieve something that we didn't expect, until we weren't under a moment of pressure, right? And this is what von Clausewitz is telling us. It's not really about the theory of that, it's the practice of that. It's also this is also physical sometimes, when we train for something, but then we have to make an expected effort that requires strength, and we say, okay, we might have been trained for something, but this wasn't enough. Like, we still perceive ourselves to be in a different way than we actually are. So you see how many different situations this thing can apply to. And von Clausewitz continues by saying, it is to a certain extent the crystalline lens through which all appearances pass before reaching the understanding, right? This is what we're saying right now, because I went on by, with the phrase without realizing that. So it's really relying on this ability, like, can I do it or not, that is going to make most things done, right? Instead of watching on YouTube those motivational speech videos that are extremely cheap and dumb, that only tell people, like, you can't always do it, right? You have to find your true self, all those things. People have difficulties. It's not that if you say such a thing, they will feel more empowered, or they will not be depressed or whatever. Depression requires medicine, by the way, just for the count. But it's mostly being realistic, like, not pretending that you can't do things you can't. Like, the best ability you have that can make you achieve something is realizing how much you're willing to lose in order to accomplish something. That's probably the singularly more important thing ever. It's not about getting that, you know, it is largely moral, it is true, and if your moral is to the ground, well, that's a serious problem. But at the same time, you know, if you're not broken, like if you don't have any pathology in practice, you know what, you know, things are like, you know what you have to do when you're confronted with a situation. Most of the times you do know what to do. The only problem is that maybe you don't have the strength to pay what that right choice costs, right? And that's where you should change the thing. That's where you should start becoming intelligent and courageous at the same time, because von Clausewitz tells that you have to do the two things. This thing of courage is essentially what it serves when you have to realize what your same force, your same moral force is, and also the one of the one against which you're fighting, basically. And it's probably the single most important aspect of the story. It's in other words, it's like starting to think from a different perspective as well. It's realizing that you can accomplish something, morally speaking. How many times you feel down, and all of a sudden you think about something that gives you strength once again, and it's that in that moment, for example, that you realize what are the things that truly matter, that give you essentially courage and strength in saying, maybe this problem will not be solved. Because guess what? Most of our problems can't be solved. But I still have, the guts to take the risk of fighting for this stuff, because I believe in something. Because I don't know, I believe I have some things that I value at the point of that is worth to fight for them. Now, this is getting a bit, maybe I'm going a bit beyond, but that's also what courage is. It's and that's where you understand that it's a moral problem, strictly speaking. It's not about the problem of what physically happened. It's a problem of how you react to that. And that's where von Clausewitz's genius comes into place. Because thinking about technicalities isn't useful as much as reconsidering what is going on and finding the strengths to cope with the general intentions, right? Just think of when we search for excuses, right? When something happens and we don't want to cope with that because we think it's boring, it's annoying, it's tiring, it will cost us something. I think the first instinctive reaction is trying to find an excuse, like saying, oh, but maybe that's too difficult, maybe you don't have time, maybe it's your fault, it's other people's fault. And then all it happens, you start simply delaying the moment which you will have to cope with that, and it's going to go worse, because in the meanwhile, in order to make all of these excuses, you're also consuming resources on your own. Then you get to the point, you understand that you have to do that anyway, and once you do it, you will even realize that it wasn't even that as difficult as you thought, as long as you went for it, like you went to solve that problem, because you decided finally to take action. And that's the point, that's the moral force, that's where that becomes determined. And if that had been a competition, like even a fight, right, that would have been a serious problem, because if the enemy has more moral force than you have, you're basically lost, not because you've been defeated physically or because you're weaker, whatever. You have been defeated just because your mind brought you down. You put yourself down. Right. So that's where the moral force is, and believe me, I'm not saying here everybody should be like immediately full of courage and moral resources, right? It's tough, and there is not a solution for everything, as we just said. But that also having that realistic take on the issue that will help you to solve it, because it's all about assessing the right picture, and that's why extremism is also very dangerous, because it's when people pretend that everything is somewhat so hostile to them, so impossible, so unsolvable, that they completely refuse to take their own responsibility for something that evidently it is, right? And will grow, will create more problems that they want, that there should be. So I had another thought about this, is that however however, by reading from Clausewitz, you can find a bit of these moral resources, right? You can only by understanding this, you have an edge, you get some advantage, right? And that's what he's trying to do. He's not talking about this just for the sake of saying, like, this is how war is, in the sense that it's a manual you simply have to applicate positivistically. Neither. It's understanding all of these implications, let's say, that will make you grow more confident. Right? Reading and understanding Vom Kriege is extremely empowering, existentially speaking, I think, because he is fair, right? He doesn't betray you. He doesn't tell you something for something else. He really tells you how it is. It's harsh, it's hard, but it's true. And that's the best realization you can ever accomplish, right? Von Clausewitz goes on and says, and yet we cannot doubt that these things acquire certain objective value simply through experience. So here Von Clausewitz is saying us what is the cream of of the sense of the meaning of art of warfare proper. That is, it is true. Like, we have enormous difficulties to understand moral forces, but experience, whichever it is, and life generally gives you experience, life and time helps you to objectivize the value of such moral forces, which doesn't mean that you will be able to quantify them, or to confine them, or to render them like immediately available, but let's say you will acquire that awareness about how certain mechanisms usually work, and you will be able to kind of more like exploit the situation than anything, and eventually even to grow kind of propositive in this sense. So this is how von Clausewitz, if you remember, like the first book, justified the existence of a theory of the art of war. That is the one he is talking about now, because he said, if everything is kind of relative to the situation, how can we even start talking about something? Because that was literally, this is literally it. Like, if everything changes and everything is so susceptible to change, how can I stand on a fixed point and do anything, right? And he tells you that through experience, you will not have that standing point, but you still will have an orientation that will help you to struggle into this, which is better than not having it. So always remember that von Clausewitz here is not, and in the Vom Kriege in general, he's never interested in sophistic, sophistries. In fact, that's what he will write at the end of this paragraph as well. But he's concerned exclusively, and I can't stress this enough, exclusively, about real things. I mean, things that make a real impact, right? That have a practical use. Right? And this realization is, okay, I can't calculate these moral forces, but if I get acquainted to them, I can start to understand them partially and to act with them a little bit. And humans are actually doing this constantly with everything. It's not that we actually know what surrounds us. Like even physics or maths, they are basically just languages that we use to interpret approximately what we think is reality, but it's not that we actually know what it is. Yet we live, and we can do a lot of things. We have built civilization, we have improved our lifestyle. So this is the real approach, philosophically speaking, is that we're swimming into the unknown, yet we can make something about it. And this is what von Clausewitz is also talking about here. And he starts making some example pertaining to war. He writes, everyone knows the moral effect of a surprise, of an attack in the flank or in the rear. Everyone thinks less of the enemy's courage as soon as he turns his back, and ventures much more in pursuit than when pursued. Right? So these are the examples continue, but just to comment on these, that is pretty interesting. The first one comments it by himself. I mean, a surprise attack in flank or rear. It's obvious, like it's something you can't cope with most of the times because you're not prepared, and that's where, in fact, it's largely the objective of the enemy, the modus operandi, let's say, of the enemy. When you see the enemy fleeing in front of you, you immediately feel that that guy is weak and morally that moment, and therefore you expose yourself much more into the pursuit of our fleeing enemy, right, than in other conditions, because you instinctively know that that's the right moment where to push the pressure on, right? And that's how battles are actually fought. So you can see that even in battles, there is, technically speaking, a similarity. Like you can't always understand how it will go, nobody can, but you can understand some essential without getting too precise about its boundaries, right? That's what von Clausewitz invites you to do in the Vom Kriege. Here it goes on and says, everyone judges of the enemy's general by his reputed talents, by his age and experience, and shapes his course accordingly. This is true. We also have this incredible ability to understand a person's behavior, by his reputation, age, experience, and general behavior. So we know what we can expect from some people. We constantly do. How many people we see in the street and we say we get an impression from? That's not even rational, right? Because we don't know those people, but immediately say, I don't know, this guy looks kind of, I don't know, sad, or maybe he doesn't look a particularly intellectual person, or this kind of thought that of course is tricky, but we get it, and the reason of that is because largely that is correct, right? It turns out to be correct, or at least it is useful for what we are put ourselves into for that specific condition, because it's not much about assessing that person's whatever, because we can't know, we're not in that person's mind. It's mostly about us. It's mostly about our own moral resources of feeling part of a group and having some role into that, and acting and moving, because that's at the end of the day what we're mostly concerned about. We have first of all to make ourselves work, then the others can later, or they think on their own in the meanwhile. This is psychology. This is biology more than else, right? It's not even an opinion. Then von Clausewitz writes, everyone casts a scrutinizing glance at the spirit and feeling of his own and the enemy's troops. Yeah, masses of people are dramatically intelligible. Right? You can understand what their general mood is. You can understand what's their strength. You can feel it. You can perceive it in the air, right? You can sense their strength, whether they're loaded, like if they're close to the end or whatever. So that's very important, and that's what we do on about everyone. Guess why? Because we need to assess the enemy moral forces, right? We're not much impressed on how they are armed, what they can do. We're impressed of their behavior, by their behavior. Like if you see one guy that has, let's say, simple experiment, you see someone in the street who has a a bar of iron, whatever. Yeah, I know it sounds weird, but what is that you actually care about? That he has a bar of iron in his arms, or what he looks like? Because once you have assessed that he has a tool that is potentially harmful, what you're really concerned about is what that guy's face looks like, for example. Because if he's angry, if he's excited, that makes a lot of difference, because that you can't see if that person can become dangerous or not in a short time. Instead of that guy is just chillingly, simply, you're probably more calm about that, right? And that's exactly what moral forces are for, and why we are already hardwired to such understanding, even if we tend to be fascinated with precision, like exact quantities and things we can't calculate. But reality works quite differently in the way we behave with others, and how, in fact, also a fight is, right? So everybody knows how much in a fight. It's not about even the physical strength. It's about moral. Like, what are you there for? What you really want to do about that? That's why we look straight in the eyes, like when certain things happen, because you want to assess what the person is doing. If a person looks away, you can immediately understand that person is shy or is intimidated, and that's where moral forces are low, or maybe that's a trick, and that's also where intelligence, however, starts coming into place, because you can't trick people exactly by cheating on moral forces, which is what in war is constantly done. And now that's clever, and that's where intelligence, in fact, enters into play. But still, we're talking about moral forces even as intelligent forces, proper meaning. At this point, yeah, I kind of made more of a emotionalistic example, but these moral forces are meant to be also intelligence, right? And obviously, when we're talking about large groups of people who fight, like a war, and at that point, more than, in fact, that fear or courage, that are basically very, very even by standard, that we consider other things, like how much that army has eaten or rested, or what is leadership doing, like whether are they competent commanders or whatever. Like, that's what starts being important as well, and more important on a larger scale, right, than just courage. It's ridiculous how people believe that wars are won because one is more courageous than the other. It's not like, doesn't work like that. It's not like the individual soldier's courage. History proves us repeatedly how you don't win wars with courage alone. Most of the times, that's not how it happens. But von Clausewitz, however, goes on and says, all these and similar effects in the province of the moral nature of man have established themselves by experience, are perpetually recurring, and therefore warrant our reckoning them as real quantities of their kind. Right? So these things are, he's saying, are basic. Like, everybody can relate to this. Everybody knows this. And we are all concerned about this in war. Like, these are all factors we're taking into account while we fight, while we wage war, and that are moral. That they embrace a spiritual dimension. It's not about the physical strength. It's about how are those people within. What are they feeling like? And he poses this rhetorical question. It is, what could we do with any theory which should leave them out of consideration? I mean, these effects, right? So nothing, of course, right? If you don't consider moral aspects of the story, you can't do anything about it. And then he concludes, certainly experience is an indispensable title for these truths. With psychological and philosophical sophistries, no theory, no general should meddle, right? So, to make the long story short, getting too much like into speculations that have to do just with theory and not with practice, you get nowhere, right? You have to test certain things on the ground in order to understand. It's impossible to plan an operation that works by itself. You have to be on the ground, see what happens, and act accordingly, right? And it seems bad, it sounds banal if if you're already acquainted how, I don't know, even the military works on the field. But this applies to everything, like to the wall clash. It has to do with the moral resources sometimes of entire peoples that fight one against the other. So that's where you should stay focused on, not much of it on their capabilities in terms of paper strength, right? Because paper strength means nothing until you don't realize how that the intelligent force, how much intelligent force animates those means, right? And that's where it brings us once again to war being a continuation of policy by other means, meaning that its means, or with other means better, because that's actually the translation, mit anderen Mitteln, so not by other means in the sense that, that's another part of the story that opens. No, it's literally that war is an instrument of politics. Hence, if you take politics out of the equation, there is nothing, military speaking. So here it's exactly the same. It's always about, that's why it's about moral forces. That's why war is chiefly about that, and not and why it's an instrument of policy, not a thing that works on its own, because it needs constantly to be fueled by those moral resources, by those intentions and motives, right? All right. So yeah, this is more or less what I wanted to tell. And I don't know how, I don't think I'm particularly easy to follow, but I think I rendered the idea of what I'm trying to explain, right? And that's why I make so many examples and I stop every phrase, because you can see how many implications exist in here between what von Clausewitz is saying and what he has already said, and what he will keep saying, actually. So yeah, this is what I wanted to tell, and therefore I hope by now that you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like or share it. Otherwise, subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.